The test system I'm going to be using is the 9800X3D plugged into an Asus ROG Strix X870 with 32 gigs of DDR5 7200 memory, a 2TB SSD, and a Corsair SF1000 power supply. The plan for this video is to thermal test the card in two small form factor cases and compare that to the open bench, then give some benchmarks and some of my thoughts on my time with the card so far. Now the first case I'm going to be using is the Fractal Ridge, because this could be an ideal situation for this style of cooler. This is a double blow-through style cooler with a PCB in the middle and two fans blowing directly through it. The Ridge is a console style case, so it's got a slim, narrow footprint with the GPU above the motherboard and power supply unit. I have the two included fans set to 50% speed because I found that to be the most tolerable setting, and I want to go for something here where there's no turbulence and a very reasonable noise level under load. With this layout, we are getting assisted fresh air from one side and then the hot air straight out the ventilation on the other without any additional obstructions. This should lend itself well to this type of cooler. And after a 15-minute stress test in Firmark, the GPU temps are leveling out in the low 80s and pulling that full 575 watts, which is a few degrees higher than my open bench test. So that's synthetic and worst case for the GPU. Let's actually take a look at gaming temperatures. The only game I've seen push the GPU as far as Firmark did so far is Black Myth Wukong at 4K. With all of the upscaling turned off and ray tracing turned on. Now running that benchmark, the GPU can hit 80s, but in actual gameplay across Black Myth, Hogwarts Legacy, and Dragon Age the Veilguard, all in 4K, it's in the mid 70s to high 70s. Now considering this insane power draw, I'm actually really impressed here. With that said, this is hotter than a 4090 Founders card, and it is using assisted airflow coming from these two case fans, but this is also a much smaller card. So what I'm more concerned about is sandwich style layouts, because all of that hot air is going to be pushed right into a wall and we may have some difficulty removing it and keeping the temperatures down. Now using the same exact components as I had in the Ridge, I moved everything over to the Nanook R. There's enough room here for me to use the same cooler I was testing in the Ridge for some level of consistency between the two. Full disclosure, I am working with Orozone on a case, but with that said, I had absolutely nothing to do with the creation of this one, and I don't receive any sort of affiliate commission or anything like that on this case. As far as sandwich style cases go, this one with its ability to use a 280mm radiator or 240mm fans at the top and then another at the front, like I have here, is going to help give us a lot of airflow, so it should give us a fair shot at thermals in the sandwich style layout. Now I've got the front one as intake and then the top as exhaust. Now after a 15-minute stress test in Firmark, the GPU temps are leveling out around 83 degrees Celsius, pulling that full 575 watts with all of the fans set to 50%. I found that this fan setting is nearly silent at 42 decibels, which is a testament to how quiet the Noctua A14 G2s are. Then when actually running a game, temperatures are high 70s to low 80s, which is about what I was expecting to see after the Firmark test. So keep in mind, this is with three top-of-the-line 140mm fans, and I think the next test will need to be in something even smaller. I've only had the card for a few days, so I haven't had the chance to do a third build just yet, but given the fact that we are in the low 80s with 340mm fans, I think it's a safe bet that we're going to be looking at slightly higher temperatures in cases that are even smaller, unless you were to do some undervolting. I guess the question is how much hotter. Okay, some quick thoughts on the card so far. Like I mentioned, I've only had it for a few days at this point, so I would consider this like a first impressions and not a full-on review. There are a ton of builds that I want to try and features to test out, but here are the benchmarks I've got so far. I'm seeing 35% average increase in rasterization performance across the 5 games that I've benchmarked so far in 4K with ray tracing off and all those other features turned off as well. And just to see what that would look like in 1440p, that increase is looking to be a 27% average increase using the 9800X3D. So the big new feature this year is multi-frame generation. You probably heard about this by now, but if you haven't, do not get fooled by these high frame rate numbers. Multi-frame generation increases the motion fluidity or the smoothness with a high frame rate, but it does not increase the response time. So the game won't feel more responsive than the base frame rate would already. With that said, if that base frame rate is high enough, then the responsiveness should still feel very good. I still wouldn't personally use this in any competitive shooters or anything like that, but I would personally use this in a story-based game. I have spotted a few small ghosting or other artifacts when I'm looking for it, like in Hogwarts Legacy. You can see the ghosting around the character if I move around quickly. I do have to really squint and be looking for it. I will be curious to see what else is uncovered over the course of the next few weeks as everyone tests this in more games, but purely from a first impression, this actually looks really good, aside from that, minor ghosting and artifacts that you may find in some instances. But with that said, my biggest fear with the technologies like this is developers using it as a crutch in place of actually optimizing their games properly. We've already seen Monster Hunter Wilds system specs referencing frame generation to hit 60. And that's not cool because again, if that base frame rate isn't high enough, especially under 60, then the game is not gonna feel good to play regardless of the frame rate with frame generation turned on. So just keep that in mind when looking at system requirements from developers from now on. So this video is coming out a few days later than I was originally expecting it to be, and that's because I was running into issues when I was moving it from the Ridge over to the Nanook. Whenever I was testing it in the Fractal Ridge, it was completely solid. I had no problems at all running any of my tests, nothing weird happening. But once I moved over to the Nanook, I was able to get to the BIOS, but I was not able to get into Windows. And after some troubleshooting, I realized it had to be my riser cable. After I went through 3 riser cables, I finally got one that was working. And there was something wrong about that. There was no way that all of these riser cables were broken. I was able to get through my thermal tests, and the next day, it started acting very unstable and weird. It turns out that Hardware Canucks, they had a similar issue, I just hadn't watched their video yet. So the solution is to go into the BIOS and change the PCI Express setting from auto to whatever generation riser cable that you're using. Now make sure you go check out their video because they are seeing some differences in the performance between the different generations of riser cables. This will affect any of us who want to build with the 5090 in any of the small form factor cases that use a cable. I'm going to try to get a hold of a few 5.0 cables to use in my future videos, but that is going to be an added expense to anybody using a 5090 in a build. I'll be talking about these cards in a lot of new builds over the coming weeks. But one more thing, if you are looking into getting one of these new Founders Edition cards, if you have one of those angled 12 volt high power adapters or cables that I think the Cooler Master power supplies come with, you're not really going to be able to use those here. You'll have to pick up a new cable, or you can use the adapter that comes in the box, which by the way, the adapter that comes in the 50 series is significantly better than the one that came in the 40 series box. It's very flexible and it just feels higher quality. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.